They were told Americans would work them to death in desert camps under the burning sun. The fascist officers had been clear about what awaited captured Italian soldiers: slavery, starvation, and shallow graves in foreign soil where their mothers would never find them. But on a crisp October morning in 1943, Giovanni Rossi stood frozen behind a chain-link fence in Missouri, watching a group of American children walk past the prison camp on their way to school. One little girl, maybe 7 years old with ribbons in her hair, stopped and waved at him through the fence. She smiled, pulled an apple from her lunch pail, and rolled it under the wire before her teacher called her away. Giovanni picked up the apple, still cold from the morning air, and felt his entire understanding of the world begin to crack like ice in spring. The apple was perfectly red, unmarked, the kind of fruit that would have been precious in wartime Italy. The child had given it away as casually as if she had dozens more at home. She had looked at him, an enemy soldier who had tried to kill Americans just months before, and seen something worth sharing with. Giovanni bit into the apple, tasted its sweetness mixed with his own tears, and wondered how everything he had believed about Americans could have been so wrong. Before we go deeper into this incredible story, if you love discovering these hidden moments from history, please subscribe and click that bell icon. And I want to ask you something. What would it take to completely change your mind about people you've been taught to hate? Could a simple act of kindness from a child be enough to shatter years of propaganda? The journey to that fence in Missouri had begun in North Africa, where Giovanni's regiment had been captured by American forces after the German retreat. He had expected execution or at least brutal treatment. The propaganda had been specific about American cruelty, their lack of culture, their hatred for Italians. Mussolini himself had declared Americans to be weak mongrels who would collapse at the first sign of real fighting. But instead of bullets, Giovanni had received medical treatment for his wounds. Instead of starvation, he had been fed regular meals. Instead of death, he had been loaded onto a ship bound for America, confused and suspicious about why his enemies were keeping him alive. The camp in Missouri was nothing like the death camps he had imagined. There were wooden barracks with actual beds, not concrete floors. There were 3 meals a day, simple but filling. There were even recreational areas where prisoners could play soccer or cards. But Giovanni trusted none of it. This had to be a trick, a way to soften them before the real punishment began. He and the other Italian prisoners whispered at night about when the Americans would reveal their true nature, when the torture would start, when they would be worked to death as the officers had promised. The first interaction with American children happened by accident. The camp was located near a small town, and the local school was visible from certain parts of the compound. The prisoners could hear children playing during recess, their voices carrying on the wind like memories of a world that still contained innocence. Some prisoners would stand at the fence during these times, listening to the laughter, remembering their own children or younger siblings back in Italy. The guards allowed this, seemed to understand the human need to hear joy even from a distance. One afternoon, a baseball from the school playground sailed over the fence and landed in the prison compound. Giovanni picked it up, examined this strange American ball that was nothing like the footballs he knew from home. A group of boys appeared at the fence, clearly nervous about approaching the prisoner compound but wanting their ball back. One brave boy, perhaps 10 years old, called out, "Mister, can we have our ball?" Giovanni did not understand the words, but the gesture was clear. He walked to the fence and gently tossed the ball over. The boys erupted in thanks, and one of them dug in his pocket and pulled out a piece of candy, pushing it through the chain link to Giovanni before they all ran away laughing. The candy was wrapped in bright paper, something called a Tootsie Roll that Giovanni had never seen before. He unwrapped it slowly, as if it might be dangerous, and tasted chocolate and something else, something uniquely American. But it was not the flavor that stayed with him. It was the exchange itself, the natural assumption by the child that kindness given would result in kindness returned. No Italian child would have dared approach enemy prisoners. No Italian parent would have allowed such proximity to danger. Yet here, American children played baseball, within sight of enemy soldiers, and thought nothing of it. Word spread among the prisoners about these interactions. Some dismissed them as meaningless, insisted the children were being used as propaganda tools, but Giovanni watched carefully and saw no adults orchestrating these moments. The children acted on their own impulses, their natural curiosity overcoming whatever warnings they might have received about the Italian prisoners. They would wave when they passed. They would sometimes stop and try to communicate through the fence, using gestures and smiles when words failed. The camp commander, a colonel from Minnesota named Anderson, noticed these interactions and made a decision that stunned the prisoners. He announced that local schools would be invited to visit the camp for cultural exchange programs. Italian prisoners who volunteered could demonstrate traditional crafts, teach Italian songs, share their culture with American children. The program was voluntary, he stressed. No one would be forced to participate, but those who did would earn small wages and privileges. Giovanni volunteered partly from curiosity and partly from a desperate need to understand these people who treated enemies so strangely. The first school visit was awkward and tense. 30 children, aged 8 to 12, entered the camp recreation hall with their teachers, eyes wide with curiosity and a little fear. The Italian prisoners had prepared demonstrations of wood carving, leather working, and traditional cooking. Giovanni had volunteered to teach Italian folk songs, remembering how his grandmother had taught them to him in the hills outside Naples. The children were shy at first, clustering near their teachers, whispering among themselves. But children's natural curiosity is stronger than taught fear. One girl asked through a translator why Giovanni's uniform was different from American soldiers. A boy wanted to know if Italy had cowboys. Another child asked if Italian children played the same games as American children. The questions were innocent, free from the political weight that adults would have brought. They saw the prisoners not as fascist enemies but as interesting strangers from a faraway place. Giovanni began teaching them a simple Italian song about a bird flying over the mountains. The children stumbled over the foreign words, giggling at their mistakes, but they tried earnestly. One boy with red hair and freckles was particularly determined, repeating the phrases until he got them right. When he finally sang a whole verse correctly, his face lit up with pride, and Giovanni felt something shift in his chest. This American child was proud to learn something Italian, saw it as an accomplishment rather than contamination by enemy culture. During the lunch break, the children shared their sandwiches with the prisoners, an act that violated several camp rules but which the guards pretended not to notice. A girl named Mary gave Giovanni half of her peanut butter and jelly sandwich, watching his face as he tasted this American combination for the first time. The sweet and salty mixture was strange but not unpleasant, and Mary laughed at his surprised expression. She tried to teach him the English words: peanut, butter, jelly, bread. He taught her the Italian: pane, burro, marmalada. They were just two people sharing food and language, the war momentarily forgotten. These visits became monthly events, and Giovanni found himself looking forward to them with an anticipation that confused and troubled him. He was supposed to hate Americans. They were the enemy who had destroyed Italian dreams of empire, who had killed his friends in Africa, who now held him prisoner thousands of miles from home. But hatred was hard to maintain when faced with children who brought him drawings they had made of Italy based on his stories, who practiced Italian songs at home and performed them proudly on the next visit, who saw him as Mr. Giovanni rather than as an enemy combatant. One child in particular affected him deeply. A boy named Tommy, perhaps 9 years old, whose father was fighting in Europe. Tommy was quiet and serious, and he always sought out Giovanni during the visits. Through the translator, Tommy asked questions about the war that the other children avoided. Did Giovanni have to kill people? Was he scared? Did he miss his family? Giovanni answered as honestly as he could, aware that this child was trying to understand what his own father might be experiencing. During one visit, Tommy brought a photograph of his father in uniform and showed it to Giovanni. "He's fighting in Italy," Tommy said through the translator. "Maybe he's fighting your friends." The weight of this possibility sat between them, A child and an enemy soldier considering the terrible arithmetic of war. Giovanni looked at the photograph, at this American father who might indeed be fighting Italians at that very moment, and then looked at Tommy's anxious face. "I hope he comes home safe," Giovanni said in his broken English, and meant it. Tommy hugged him then, quickly and awkwardly, before running back to his classmates. That hug haunted Giovanni. An American child, whose father was fighting Italians, had embraced an Italian soldier. The simple humanity of it, the child's ability to separate the individual from the conflict, made Giovanni question everything about the ideology he had been fed. Fascism had taught that Americans were racially inferior, culturally bankrupt, incapable of true civilization. But this child showed more wisdom and grace than any propaganda minister ever had. The children began bringing gifts for the prisoners, small items that meant everything in the emotional economy of the camp. Handmade cards with carefully printed Italian phrases copied from library books. Cookies baked with their mothers using precious wartime sugar rations. Drawings of Italy based on encyclopedia pictures, with Mount Vesuvius always smoking dramatically. One girl brought Giovanni a small American flag she had made in school, not understanding the irony of giving this symbol to an enemy prisoner. He kept it anyway, hidden under his mattress, a reminder that symbols meant different things to different people. The camp guards watched these interactions with interest. Many were young men unfit for combat duty, some with their own children at home. They saw how the prisoners changed after the school visits, became less sullen, more cooperative, more human. One guard, a corporal from Iowa named Peterson, told Giovanni through a translator that his own grandparents had emigrated from Germany. 40 years ago, they were foreigners who barely spoke English, he said. Now I'm as American as apple pie. That's what this country does. It takes enemies and makes them neighbors. Giovanni wanted to argue, to point out that he was a prisoner, not an immigrant, that he had not chosen to be in America. But the words would not come because he was beginning to understand something fundamental. The children who visited were not being taught to hate their enemies. They were being taught that even enemies were human, that culture and knowledge were valuable regardless of their source, that understanding different people was a strength rather than a weakness. This was so different from the fascist education that it seemed like another species of thinking entirely. Christmas of 1943 brought an unexpected development. The local school invited 20 prisoners to attend their Christmas pageant, under guard of course, but as guests rather than prisoners. Giovanni was selected, and he sat in the school auditorium watching American children perform the nativity story. Mary, the girl who had shared her sandwich, played an angel. Tommy was a shepherd. They waved at him from the stage, and he waved back, feeling absurd and moved in equal measure. After the performance, the children gave the prisoners handmade Christmas cards, many attempting Italian phrases like Buon Natale in careful, childish handwriting. One card particularly moved Giovanni. It was from a girl named Susan who had drawn a picture of Italy and America holding hands across the ocean. Inside, she had written in painstaking Italian, "When the war is over, we can be friends." The innocence of it, the assumption that friendship was the natural state once conflict ended, the child's faith in a better future, all of it contradicted the fascist worldview that saw perpetual struggle as the natural condition of nations. Children, Giovanni realized, had to be taught to hate. Without that teaching, they defaulted to curiosity and kindness. The winter months brought fewer visits because of weather, but the children sent letters to the camp, addressed to specific prisoners they had befriended. Giovanni received several, mostly drawings and simple messages, but one from Tommy was longer. His teacher had helped him write it. "Dear Mr. Giovanni, my dad sent a letter, and he is okay. He said the Italian people are nice and just want the war to be over like us. He said after the war, maybe we can visit Italy and see the places you told us about. I am learning more Italian words. Arrivederci, Tommy." The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. Everything Giovanni had been taught about Americans was being disproven by children who had no reason to be kind to him except their own natural inclination toward friendship. The fascist ideology that had shaped his worldview was crumbling under the weight of sandwiches shared, songs taught, hugs given by children who saw him as a person rather than an enemy. The children were not naive. They knew there was a war. They knew their fathers and brothers were fighting. But they also knew that the Italian prisoner who taught them songs was not personally responsible for the war, was just a man caught up in historical forces beyond his control. Spring brought renewed visits and a special request. The school was studying different cultures, and they wanted the Italian prisoners to help create an Italian day with food, music, and art. Giovanni and the others threw themselves into the preparation with an enthusiasm that surprised them. They cooked pasta with tomato sauce using ingredients the school had specially obtained. They taught traditional dances. They displayed crafts and artwork. The children participated with joy, wearing paper chef hats they had made, attempting Italian dances with hilarious results, eating pasta with varying degrees of success. During the Italian Day celebration, Giovanni watched American children celebrating his culture, the culture of an enemy nation, with genuine enthusiasm and respect. Teachers encouraged them to learn Italian words. Parents who attended smiled and applauded. The local newspaper took photographs. No one seemed to find it strange or dangerous that children were learning from enemy prisoners. This openness, this confidence that exposure to different cultures was enriching rather than corrupting, was perhaps the most radical difference between American and fascist worldviews. One moment from that day stayed with Giovanni forever. A small boy, perhaps 6 years old, too young to really understand the war, walked up to him and said in carefully practiced Italian, "Grazie per insegnarci," "Thank you for teaching us." The child's mother stood nearby, smiling encouragingly. She had obviously helped her son practice this phrase, had thought it important for him to thank an enemy prisoner in that prisoner's own language. The generosity of spirit this represented, the fundamental decency of teaching a child to show gratitude even to enemies, was so far from fascist ideology that Giovanni could not reconcile the two worldviews as existing in the same reality. As spring turned to summer, news from the war filtered into the camp. Italy had switched sides. Mussolini had fallen. The Allies were advancing up the Italian peninsula. The prisoners were confused, divided, unsure what any of this meant for their futures. But the children who visited remained constant in their friendship. They did not care about the complex politics of Italy's changing allegiances. Mr. Giovanni was still Mr. Giovanni, still the man who taught them songs and told them stories about olive groves and ancient Roman ruins. The final school visit before summer vacation was emotional. The children knew that the war in Europe was ending, that the prisoners would eventually be sent home. They brought goodbye gifts, photographs, drawings, small American flags, letters promising to remember their Italian friends. Mary gave Giovanni a book of American children's stories, inscribed with, "So you can remember us." Tommy gave him a baseball, the American ball that had started these interactions, signed by all the children who had visited over the year. Giovanni struggled to express what these visits had meant. Through the translator, he told the children that they had taught him more than he had taught them. They had taught him that enemies were made by circumstances, but friends were made by choice. They had taught him that kindness could cross any boundary, that children everywhere wanted the same things: to learn, to play, to be safe, to be loved. They had shown him an America that no propaganda had prepared him for. An America where enemy prisoners could teach songs to children, where different cultures were celebrated rather than feared, where the default assumption was that people were good until proven otherwise. When news came that the Italian prisoners would be repatriated in the fall of 1945, Giovanni felt not relief but a strange sadness. He would leave this place where children had shown him such unexpected friendship. He would return to an Italy devastated by war, uncertain in peace, struggling to rebuild not just buildings but its entire identity. But he would carry with him the memory of American children who had rolled apples under fences, shared sandwiches, learned Italian songs, and refused to see him as an enemy even when their fathers were fighting as countrymen. The last time Giovanni saw the fence where that first apple had rolled through He stood there for a long moment, remembering. He had arrived, believing he would die in this place, worked to death by cruel Americans who hated everything Italian. Instead, he had been transformed by children who had shown him that hatred was learned but kindness was natural, that war was temporary but humanity was permanent, that enemies could become friends if given half a chance. The apple that little girl had given him had been more than fruit. It had been an invitation to see the world differently. On the ship back to Italy, Giovanni carefully packed the baseball, the book, the drawings, all the gifts the children had given him. Other prisoners mocked him for treasuring these items, called him weak for being swayed by American propaganda. But Giovanni knew better. It had not been propaganda that changed him. It had been children acting on their natural impulses toward friendship. Children who had not yet learned that some people were supposed to be enemies. Children who had shown him that the fascist worldview was not just wrong but tragically, unnecessarily wrong. Back in Italy, trying to rebuild his life in the ruins, Giovanni often thought about those children. Tommy would be growing up now, playing that American baseball game, perhaps remembering the Italian prisoner who had hoped his father would come home safe. Mary would be reading books, maybe sometimes thinking about the man she had shared her sandwich with. Susan would still believe that Italy and America could hold hands across the ocean. These children had given him something more valuable than food or comfort. They had given him hope that the world could be different, that the next generation might build something better from the ashes of war. Years later, when Giovanni had his own children in the new democratic Italy, he would tell them about the American children who had changed his mind about everything. He would teach them that hatred was a choice, but so was kindness. He would insist that they learn about different cultures, meet different people, reserve judgment until they knew individuals rather than stereotypes. He would tell them about the apple rolled under a fence, about peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, about Christmas pageants where Italian prisoners were welcome guests. He would teach them what the American children had taught him, that common humanity was stronger than political division, that understanding was more powerful than fear, that children everywhere wanted the same things regardless of the flags their countries flew. The Italian prisoners had thought they would die in American camps. Instead, they had been reborn through the simple kindness of children who had refused to see them as enemies. It was not the grand gestures that had changed them, but the small ones: shared lunches, practiced phrases, handmade cards, awkward hugs. The children had shown them an America that was confident enough to be generous, strong enough to be kind, secure enough to celebrate even enemy cultures. This was the America that no propaganda could have explained, the America that existed in the hearts of children who had not yet learned to hate. Giovanni lived a long life, saw Italy rebuilt, saw former enemies become allies, saw the world his children and grandchildren inherited become smaller and more connected. But he never forgot those Missouri children who had changed everything he believed. In his final years, he would still sometimes hold that old baseball, now worn smooth by decades of handling, and remember Tommy's anxious face as he asked about his father. He would page through Mary's book of children's stories and remember her laugh when he tried peanut butter for the first time. He would look at Susan's drawing of Italy and America holding hands and think that perhaps, in some small way, the children's vision had come true. And there were thousands more stories like this, waiting to be remembered,